Today, we're working on getting fired. Hello and welcome to Working on It, the podcast that helps you navigate the complexities of today's working environment. I'm Lauren Spearman, brand consultant and advocate for care, transparency and flexibility at work.
And I'm Molly Johnson-Jones, CEO and co-founder of Flexer. Lauren and I are here to provide you with practical advice, hopefully insightful discussions, and expert guidance on how to thrive in your career.
And today, Molly, we're covering quite a tough topic, getting fired.
Something that I've had a fair amount of experience with.
Which we'll come on to.
Yeah, I don't want to skip ahead to that first. But we'll have a look at what to do if you find yourself in this situation. We'll also discuss our own personal stories of getting fired, of which I have more than one, and share a listener story and just talk about generally how to handle it moving forward, because it's not a topic that's particularly well discussed. I think it's become quite controversial and thorny, whereas actually it will probably happen to everybody at some point in their lives.
We should probably set the scene first a little bit. When it comes to getting fired, my understanding, there's probably two main reasons why people get fired. Yep. One, performance, two, some kind of misconduct. Yep. Can you talk us through a little bit of those?
Ultimately, kind of in the first 2 years of employment, as long as it's not discrimination, you can be fired for pretty much anything, because an employer can just say that they no longer want to employ you. But the main ones are, exactly that, performance issues. So, there'll be loads of times where somebody's hired and they're obviously given targets or set KPIs to meet, and they don't do that in the course of, their employment, or maybe they kind of don't have the skills that were actually needed to do the job. And there was a bit of a mistake when they were hired, or just consistent underperformance, not the right attitudes. There's also more like softer, less obvious ones, like you can be fired for like lack of professionalism or not conducting yourself in the right way. Like there are loads of different ones. And then on the misconduct side, that's where it gets a bit more controversial. So like gross negligence, theft, harassment, insubordination, just general bad behaviour. And those are the kind of main buckets that people will have likely to be fired for.
We mentioned the kind of 2 year mark, which is obviously a bit of a benchmark. How will someone know if they've been fired fairly or there's grounds for unfair dismissal?
So at the moment, you can only claim unfair dismissal after 2 years, although actually Labour are trying to reform that so that unfair dismissal can happen from day one. But from a sort of unfair dismissal perspective, let's look at it before the 2 years. So you can still be discriminated against within those 2 years. So if you are a minority group, then obviously that may well be that there was discrimination against you, a woman, a person of colour, LGBTQ plus community, whatever it might be. Same with if you are neurodivergent or have dyslexia or ADHD and there weren't fair or reasonable accommodations made for you and you feel like you were let go of because of the fact that you are neurodivergent or there was a certain thing that you needed accommodation for. Same with disabilities and conditions, like basically any extenuating circumstance that wasn't properly accommodated for, you can say, I believe I've been discriminated against, and then take that to ACAS, which is like an employment tribunal, and then it may or may not go to court, or it might be resolved before that. But after the 2 years, then unfair dismissal can come in. So it might be that you feel like you actually were performing and you can dispute it, or perhaps the conditions of your role were changed, or where you needed to do your role changed, and you felt like therefore you were being forced out. There are so many different reasons that somebody can claim unfair dismissal, especially if it comes down to like you don't feel like they gave you a good enough reason for losing your job, which actually happens more than you'd think.
Because I imagine that if you're getting fired, for especially performance-related stuff, that shouldn't be a surprise, because if the employer has behaved, I guess, correctly, whatever the term is, you should be aware that your performance is lacking, or maybe you've been put on a PIP, or there should be... you should have been given enough kind of heads up that if things weren't going to change, you'd be on your way out.
And if you go through proper process, yes, but the number of people I think that don't realise that they're underperforming over that period of time is genuinely mad. Like, I think loads of people think that they'll come back from a PIP, a performance improvement plan. The likelihood of that happening is very, very low, because that is just due process after 2 years to hopefully see a big improvement. But the likelihood of somebody totally overhauling it and then ending up not being fired at the end of a PIP is really, really low.
So do you think a PIP is more to protect the employer, to show that they've showed willing, when they're probably not really asked about the person actually improving?
I wouldn't say definitively yes, but in general, I think if you get put on a PIP, it's probably better to resign, and then you can hopefully, ask your manager for a reference. You're not going to have this very difficult situation where you have to explain why you lost your job. It's much better to just go, actually, this isn't right for me. I can sense that I'm being seen as underperforming, or maybe I know I'm underperforming, and then leave. I think loads of people don't think enormously strategically about being fired. And if you sense something like that is happening, it is ultimately better to walk and take control of the situation that you're in, because then none of it's a surprise. It's not taken personally. You part ways in a much more amicable as half firing can be. But I think that's definitely the better way to go. But the PIP is just due process.
Yeah. And I guess we're obviously looking at it through the lens of if you're being, fired or put on review. But from the flip side, if you're a manager and you have put someone on, on review, like that's never a nice thing to do, to put someone in that situation. But I also think you probably shouldn't let them get to the point where it's like the final meeting and they have no clue of how that review is going. So I guess my advice on that is to give some regular check-ins, and maybe if you really feel like there's no coming back, start to have conversations of what does work outside of this look like? Can I help you? Is there anyone I can put you in touch with, for example?
I also think it's so difficult as a manager because very few people are trained on this kind of thing. Like, so often when you're managing people, you've been put in that position because you were good at your job. Then you were promoted, and then you've suddenly got a load of people under you that you manage. Like, very few people are trained to be a manager and end up in that management position because they're good with people, which is actually probably the way around that it should be done, as well as being good at your job. So you end up in that position where nobody likes having difficult conversations at work, right? And I think very often when performance issues start to form and start to become a little bit apparent in those first couple of months, the manager's tendency is like, oh, maybe it'll get better. Maybe it'll go away. Maybe I don't need to have this conversation. Whereas actually, I think it's really important in a manager-managee relationship to consistently have open feedback where it's like, you're doing these things really well, but this thing needs work. So then when a more difficult conversation comes up where it's like you're underperforming, you've been laying those sort of conversation threads for that time.
And it comes back to that earlier point of it shouldn't feel like a surprise. No. I think where it becomes tough is where you've got a really good relationship with that member of staff. Like if you even, if you're friends or, no one wants to be in that position where they're speaking to someone they're friendly with. But ultimately you have to do what's right for the company and the wider
and for
team.
Them as well. Yeah. Like, it's not right for them to stay consistently underperform. Then you're probably going to develop anxiety around work, around the fact that you're not doing a good enough job, and you're going to fade and feel much less happy in your career and not you're thriving. It's better to sort of have a manager who's looking out for you and going, maybe this isn't right for you anymore. Maybe if you want to talk about it, there might be another brilliant opportunity for you somewhere else. I will give you an amazing reference. I think quite often people assume that somebody encouraging you to go and look somewhere else is because they don't want you anymore, and it's very easy to see that as them seeing you in a negative light, whereas it can sometimes be like, I don't think this is quite right for you, but I think you're going to be amazing somewhere else or doing something else in a different place.
Yeah. And this sounds quite brutal, but I remember once there was someone that I managed, she came in after a weekend and she was like, I've read this book by, I think it was the Netflix CEO, and he said there was a line in it where he said the team is only as good as the worst person in it. And
Netflix are notorious for their nice culture.
But I do think sometimes it is for the greater good to move people along. Yeah. Because it can bring other people down, especially if you've got someone maybe more from a enthusiasm performance point of view where they're really dragging people down. It then affects everyone else. They're like, well, if I can get away with that, then I will.
Exactly.
So
it doesn't set the right cultural example at all. And I think, again, that's why when we talk about businesses, and it's so difficult to make those decisions because there's a lot that people don't see that goes on behind the scenes, as you say, whether it's somebody's being a bit toxic in some way that you've seen and no one else has, or somebody's not representing the company in the way that you would expect it, or somebody that's client-facing is not being the face of the company that you would want them to be. There's so much subtlety in how you construct those teams. And not even just from a business perspective, as you said, when you're managing a team, you need to make sure that everybody has the right expectations, that they're performing at the right level. And sometimes there'll be one or two people that just aren't facilitating that anymore, and it's the time for them to go. But I do think people have such a lack of awareness of when it's the right time to jump. I really do. I've seen it happen. I've probably done it too, right?
Oh, I mean, I've definitely worked places where you're like, why are you still here?
Yeah, and then you look back when you left, you're like, why didn't I do that 6 months ago?
I remember the job that I got like slowly fired for, whatever it was, 6 months before I had a call with my coach and I was like, I need to go.
Yeah.
Because it's dragging me down.
Yeah.
And I'm becoming someone I don't want to be. I'm becoming someone that's like constantly on edge.
Yeah. And you can come back from that like as well. And I think that it's really hard to understand like when the right time to leave is and when it's a difficult period of time or a difficult project or a difficult co-worker that you're next to for too much of your time because of what you're working on. And I think it's sometimes, although the majority of people don't jump quickly enough, some people jump as soon as there is any issue at all, which also isn't great.
No, because sometimes you can mess up a little bit, but you can learn from it.
Exactly.
And maybe it's because of the work we do, but I feel like I'm seeing more and more people getting fired or pushed out or whatever circumstance where they're leaving under kind of dodgy circumstances. Do you have any stats on people getting fired? Like, what's the scale of how many people are getting fired a year?
Like, why do you think you see more people?
Because I'm showing more interest.
Your algorithm is feeding it to you.
Yeah, even one this morning, it was like she's got like 100,000 likes. So just kind of started off. Yeah, she started the morning, ready to take on Friday, and then she was like, "Fuck, I got fired 2 hours later."
Yeah, I don't know if more people are being fired. I actually don't have the stats on that, but I feel like people are being much more vocal about it on social media, like particularly Gen Z, I would say. Like, you notice it, like people quitting while filming themselves on TikTok.
What's your take on that? Because I was asked by journalists recently of like, do I approve of that? Do I think people are shooting themselves in the foot?
Yeah. I think reputationally it's not a great thing to do. Like, pretty much everybody, whether it's a hiring manager, whether it's in reference checks or like due diligence, they're going to look you up, right? And then imagine if they just find a video of you quitting on TikTok at your previous job. You'd be like, oh, that feels a bit much for me. You should take a risk on an employee.
But when you employ someone, do you search through their social media?
No, I actually never have.
Because I think that's like, you just said it there. I was like, I feel like we say that a lot, but who really goes through? And
I would look at their LinkedIn. I would look at their LinkedIn, definitely.
But assuming on something like TikTok, they might not even have the same name.
But if they went viral,
yes.
And then that got like, somebody came across it, right? Because those videos do really well. And then you get millions of people seeing it. The likelihood of somebody seeing that and then associating it, I don't know. I think it's too much of a risk to take.
I'm very pro it. You mentioned at the start you've got your own experience with being fired.
Yeah.
Fill us in a little bit more on that.
It's like Henry VIII's wives, my job history. So I got made redundant from my first job, then sacked from my second job. Then I voluntarily left my third. Then I got half made redundant, half resigned from my fourth. Voluntarily left my fifth, got sacked from my sixth.
So you've never left a job on good terms?
Twice. Once to start Flexit, and they were super supportive about that. They were actually great because they let me go down to part-time, and then eventually I left. And they were really, really good. That was my penultimate employer before going full-time on Flexit. And then one, it was okay terms. I just, didn't feel like I was being rewarded for the value that I was providing.
Fair enough. And I'm sure in another episode we'll cover off the redundancies, but tell us about firing.
So the second job that I had was probably the most traumatic firing. So I've got an autoimmune condition that means that sometimes like my feet swell up, my hands swell up, my face swells up. So I can still work, but trying to get into an office was really, really difficult. I got diagnosed with that when I was at university. And I stupidly chose to go into investment banking. Not very flexible. Mm-hmm. And I'd continued. So I got made redundant. Genuinely, the whole company went under and got acquired. So then I went into the same role at a different firm. It was about 18 months there, and they were saying after about 18 months, well, we're open to flexible working, because I was, wearing like slippers on my commute to try and manage to get to the office like 5-6 days a week, working 14, 16-hour days. Like I wasn't able to manage my condition at all, and I was getting quite bad to the point where about once a week I physically couldn't walk. And they were like, well, you can request flexible working because we're really open to it. And I was like, oh, surprising. Because I was like one woman in a team of like 50 men. Absolutely nobody was working flexibly. Mm. So I was like, cool, that's really surprising. But I'll put in a request to work from home one day a week.
But the fact that you even had to put in the request and they didn't say, let's just talk about, like, they're not offering it first?
But I think that was, again, the sort of due process part of it. Like, I think if I look back, and I was only 23 when that happened, I had absolutely no idea what was going on. So I think it was all a due process thing, because then when I put that request in, then they sent me to an occupational health therapist, obviously to assess, like, am I telling the truth? But that slightly backfired on them, because the occupational health therapist that I saw was like, your condition's so severe, you should be classified as disabled. So then I become protected at that point. And I think they were like, shit, like, maybe we shouldn't have done that. And then 10 days after that diagnosis with the occupational health therapist, they pulled me into a room and they were like, with like an HR person in there, my boss's boss, and a settlement package in front of me. I was devastated, because I was like, shit, I've lost my job. I couldn't believe it. And again, you look back, I was like, was I underperforming? And I was like, no, I wasn't. Like, I was getting close to like quite a big milestone of doing my own coverage there. And they were just like, no, there is no way around this. Like, you have to get your stuff and leave now.
Oh, wow. Literally marched you out the office.
I wasn't allowed to get my stuff. They posted it to me. I had my phone and I was allowed to get my coat. That was it. That was literally it. I just had my phone, and I went downstairs, sat on the bench outside and just cried. And I was like, what the fuck do I do?
But also that just must have been mortifying if colleagues saw, and because it looks like you've done
something terrible.
Wrong.
Yeah. And then I found out later through this whole process, because then I had a 3-month notice period. So they were like, you leave today, we'll work out all the finer details of whether this goes to court or whatever it did through those 3 months. So I bumped into one of the guys that I used to be friends with and work with at a festival about 2 months afterwards. I remember him coming up to me and he was like, oh, Molly, it's really nice to see you. And I was like, yeah, I haven't heard from you at all. And he was like, I can't really tell you this, but he was quite drunk. He was like, we have been banned from speaking to you. We're not allowed to contact you. We're not allowed to speak to you. And he was like, that's why you haven't heard from anybody.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah. So it was obviously like this whole process, because they knew that it could escalate because of the fact that I had a protected category around being disabled.
I'm also guessing if there's a settlement in front of you, you were probably silenced from saying really what happened.
But I didn't sign it.
Oh.
Until
nice.
I was like, I'm not signing this until I've gotten legal advice. And we only resolved it after about 2.5 months. But until I signed it, I wasn't allowed to speak to anybody, do anything, say anything. And then eventually I got a really good lawyer, and we managed to negotiate the settlement out, and then I agreed, and exactly under NDA. So that's why I've like cleansed my internet history. Like, you cannot tell where it is. And that's why I can speak openly about it, but without naming them, because nobody can find who it was, basically.
Fine. Yeah, so you've protected yourself in that way.
Yeah, it was wild. Like, I look back at that, and yeah, that was a pretty extreme example of being sacked, because obviously they also had to, even though I was within the 2 years, there was a whole discrimination thing around it. But the discrimination side of things can be quite hard to prove. It was just very obvious from the timeline with them. They'd kind of screwed that up. But had I just been let go and then performance issues were blamed, it would have been very hard for me to prove that it was related.
Yes. Whereas I guess that's the thing as well, isn't it? When you've got a settlement in front of you, you have to weigh up is it worth going to court?
Yeah, like how much more would you get? And in that situation, there was no more that I would
Whereas getting a lawyer, and a lot of like lawyers will give you an hour's free advice at least to start, because I think that's the fear, isn't it? That's going to cost you an absolute fortune. Whereas
you can speak to a lawyer for half an hour for free, and then they often do that if they think that, obviously not if they think you're only going to get like $5,000 from the case, but if they think you're going to get a decent amount, they will do it as no win, no fee, and then they'll take a proportion of the settlement.
Yeah.
But actually in that scenario, part of the settlement was that they would pay for a lawyer for me, which was also quite common in those kind of like thorny sides of it, because they can't be seen without me getting representation, really. It looks very bad for them.
Got you.
Have you ever been fired?
I've not been fired. I've been slowly pushed out, like not quite a firing. I had an experience a few years ago where I had a boss who within 4 weeks of him joining, him and me, his direct reports and him all had to be pulled into HR to talk about his behaviour. Nothing really got done, and I was just very vocal the entire time he was there about his behaviour. Eventually, after 9 months, he got sacked for, it was actually misconduct. But
what kind of misconduct?
Can I say it?
Vaguely.
There was a Christmas party where I don't know if this will get cut. We'll go with it. There was a Christmas party, and across the table, he asked a member of staff if she was going to go home and fuck her boyfriend hard that night.
What the fuck?
Yeah.
Why?
Why indeed? It's a question we'll never know. But what kind of happened, I think actually when you're in almost like quite fight or flight mode, I think you don't often realise the impact of someone until they've left.
Yeah.
And I was kind of constantly talking to HR about like his behaviour, and then it just was never addressed. It was like, well, it's gone, it's brushed under the carpet. And then I guess the last time I vocalised it, I was asked by HR if we'd like to discuss whether I stay in the business. I was like, whoa, okay. And like you, I got offered a settlement. And it's interesting what you mentioned earlier about the kind of PIP, performance review. Often that is the start of the end. And I knew that if I was being offered that, how could I stay with my values and go back to that, knowing that they weren't prepared to make any changes? Yeah, I had this weird few weeks where they said that to everyone I was off sick, and I was like, I know that I'm not sick, but that was a kind of cover up because we were discussing like the settlement,
which you kind of have to.
I got a lawyer involved, and then I left, and it was obviously like the line was I decided to pursue new opportunities, blah blah blah. But the saddest thing of all of it was the day that I signed the paperwork, the person from HR said to me, like, this is such a shame because you only wanted to make things better. So, yeah, it wasn't like a brutal firing, but it was...
You made you feel like you couldn't say anymore.
Yeah, and I think the way in which I left, I'd been there quite a while and hadn't done anything wrong. And I think I felt like I think it raised a lot of questions, and that was quite embarrassing.
Yeah.
And it looked like I couldn't cope because they kind of had said that I was off sick. So firing comes in lots of different forms, right? Like that wasn't like a hard go. Yeah. But I think they knew that it was easier to just shut me up than it was to make fundamental like change within the business.
Yeah. And I think what's very tricky is obviously you can see it from the personal side of it, like being fired is awful, and it will always feel personal. But then from a business perspective, so often there's so much going on behind the scenes, and there's like businesses when it's full of various different people, it's like a house of cards, and you sort of have to try to keep it together. So it's such a difficult position because you can kind of see it from both sides. You can be like, that was such unfair treatment and you were just trying to make it better. And like not necessarily in this example, like it does sound like the business did the wrong thing, but then there are other situations where like maybe somebody is going through a tough time, but they've been underperforming for 6 months. Like how long can you as a business support that? Like it becomes untenable at that point, really. Yeah, and I think it's a difficult balance of those two things, but ultimately just have to follow proper due process. Otherwise you get in trouble.
Of course. Let's talk advice. Yeah. If someone finds themselves in that situation of being fired, I guess what is your take on what they should do first?
Well, if it was a sense of the fact that it was maybe going that way from if it's a performance review or you're having multiple conversations around the fact that something needs to change, I would really look into leaving and finding a new opportunity. That would be my number one piece of advice. If you feel like there is any risk of you being sort of pushed out, just go. And then if you are sat down and told you're fired, my first piece of advice would be don't sign anything, commit to anything, say anything, unless you want to leave, in which case, agree with it and go. Yeah. But I would immediately speak to a lawyer. Yeah. As soon as you possibly can. Try to get as much understanding from the lawyer of like the situation that you're in. And it might be, really, the majority of cases are really black and white, like you could be let go, but it's still worth being aware of what your rights are.
I think so. And also from like more of an emotional side of it, not being afraid to like lean into your like support network as well, whether that's friends or family or if, colleagues, depending on the circumstances of what's happened. I think sometimes people can feel a little bit of shame in what's happened. Whereas I think to your point earlier, it's more common than we maybe think. And actually there is maybe a shift as well of trying to look forward to what's next.
Yeah, exactly. It can be an opportunity.
Yes, exactly. Something that's really stuck out with me from my business coach I speak to when I kind of left that business I spoke about, she was like, you need to get into run towards mode. At the moment, you're just running away from what's happened in terms of like, you just want to forget it's happened, but you actually like need to grieve it and get over it so that then you can look forward to it. Because I got myself in a position where I was like, I am never going to enjoy work again.
This is very dramatic.
Yeah, a little bit divish. And she was like, chill the fuck out. But I was like, I just can't imagine when you've come out of a situation that feels quite fraught. I can't imagine going somewhere where I would feel like I could be myself, or I could raise things and they'd be looked at. So she was like, you really need to take the time to grieve it, get over it, get it all out your system, and then really be able to look forward to it and focus on the future.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice, because I think also there's a natural tendency that we have as humans to sometimes confuse the source of our unhappiness. And I think if you were feeling like that after losing a role and then you'd gone straight into another one because you were feeling sad and emotional and a bit rejected by it, you then could have carried those feelings into that other job and then been like, oh, maybe this isn't the right one for me either, because you hadn't got rid of all of those feelings.
And you end up repeating the same patterns. It's a bit like dating. Like if you just jump from one relationship to the next without questioning, okay, why didn't that work out? Then you're going to find yourself in a similar situation. From an employer's perspective, it's obviously imperative that they follow a really clear structure, procedure, make sure it's all legal. What would you give advice to an employer on this?
Make sure your hiring managers know what to do in this situation, because it's very easy for somebody that doesn't understand it to do something wrong. And then you end up having to deal with the repercussions of a hiring manager that wasn't trained on it. But then I'd go even before that, like make sure that your managers know how to have difficult conversations, consistently have a culture of open but constructive and fair feedback. And then I think also having a culture where it's okay to make mistakes, but make people aware of the fact that they have screwed up, but that it's okay and they can come back from it. But then when it starts to go further, managers need to understand what the legalities of getting rid of somebody is or are, and ensure that they're not saying anything that could land you in trouble. And most of that will then happen with, you need a good employment lawyer to have a relationship with, not somebody that you just bring in completely randomly. It helps that they have context. And so just follow due process, make sure that you're aware of all of the categories of discrimination that can happen. And obviously the probation period into first 2 years employment, and then after 2 years, and all of the differences in how the law changes amongst all of those things.
I'd also add to that, and if you're a hiring manager having to fire someone, take your own personal opinion out of it, because I think there is a tendency, because it's not a nice thing to do.
Yeah.
Make sure it's not like, I feel so bad telling you this, or it's not about you.
Or, oh, I've been told to do this. In all likelihood, unless you are a hiring manager that has been told to do it and you don't want to fire somebody, don't blame somebody else for it, because it takes away from the fact that that person wasn't right in that role at that time.
And definitely be clear and compassionate, but just take your own person, don't make it about you when you're in that situation.
Oh yeah, because your feeling of firing somebody, your awkwardness or sadness or whatever it is going to be much less than the person that's on the receiving end of it.
Yes,
so you shouldn't be thinking about people feeling sorry for you. Actually try to be a bit human about it.
And I guess there's almost an element of, if you are right on the verge of being fired, you just get in there first and resign.
Yeah.
Because that's moving forward into interviewing the next
You're taking control, you can get a proper reference, you will maintain good relationships, you will feel much more empowered by the situation than you will if you leave it too long. And I think people often get very worried. They're like, oh no, but it's going to be so difficult for me to find a job, or it's going to be so difficult to explain why I left so quickly. It's going to be more difficult to find a job when you've got the fact that you have to explain why you left. And then often after you've been fired, which I think a lot of people don't realise, that company that you were working at cannot give you a reference. They can say they worked here from this time till this time, but they cannot give you a positive reference.
What's the deal with references now anyway? Because don't most employers just confirm that they worked there for that period? Do many give that actual
A lot of companies
reference?
will still ask to speak to somebody from a character reference perspective.
Okay.
Still quite common. If you leave a company at the right time and you say, can somebody give me a good reference? Then obviously you coming forward and saying, I can also speak to my old manager. They'll talk to you about all of my work. Coming forward with that also makes you a much stronger candidate than just being confirming this person worked from X to X. It can be a bit of a red flag if there's no further reference apart from that, because it signals that they may be abiding by the law that they have to go through.
Or it's just a lazy employer that doesn't want to bother giving a reference.
Yes, could be that too. Could be that too. And there are lots of those.
This is a quick reminder you're listening to Working On It, the podcast that unpacks the trials and tribulations of today's work environment, with me, Lauren Spearman.
And me, Molly Johnson-Jones. It's time for a quick break.
Motherhood isn't easy. The daily struggles, the worries, the mum guilt and the unending demands can be overwhelming. We want to introduce you to Mindful Mamas, the maternal mental health app for every stage of the motherhood journey. Founded by a psychologist, Mindful Mamas created the first programme that spans the entire life cycle of motherhood, from trying to conceive through to empty nesting. Cultivate peace and serenity in your daily life, enjoy more restful sleep, strengthen the connection with yourself and your family. Whether you have 60 seconds or 10 minutes, the Mindful Mamas app offers sips of self-care anytime, anywhere. Mindful Mamas is dedicated to creating happy, healthy and thriving mothers worldwide. Join over 350,000 mums who have found strength with Mindful Mamas and make mental well-being a priority. Your family doesn't need a perfect mother, they just need you. We have a special offer for our listeners today, so to claim your 1-year subscription for just $29, email support@mindfulmamasclub.com and mention code WOI29.
Coming up, we're going to discuss the difference between getting fired and being made redundant. But first of all, let's explore a real-life scenario from a listener. So this one is from Sam in Brighton.
Oh, hit me.
So, I was working at this tech startup and things were going great until the quarterly party. Our boss decided that it would be a brilliant idea to have a karaoke machine and an open bar. One thing led to another and I ended up being on stage belting out "I Will Survive." But that wasn't the problem. I was like, is that a problem?
Terrible choice.
But that wasn't the problem. The problem was that I decided to change the lyrics to roast the entire management team. It got a few laughs, but apparently the CEO didn't find it amusing. A few days later, I was called into the office and told my performance was no longer needed. I'm looking for a new job and trying to find out how to explain this on my CV. That's a bit awkward, isn't it?
I mean, that is a bit of a brutal. I also wonder, was there booze involved? And was it outside
there
of
was
work
an open
time,
bar.
which is always a bit tricky, right?
But then it's professional conduct still in those scenarios.
I feel we do need to dissect this, but I've got a story that's not too dissimilar.
Yeah, go for it.
I went to a work party. It was like a conference, like a 2-day conference or something. I think it was in Mallorca, and got absolutely everyone got absolutely annihilated. So much booze. And the next morning we had to go to the airport. I was completely passed out, missed the coach to the airport. Someone woke me up. I jumped in a cab, made it to the flight, fine. But the fear of I'd missed the coach. But anyway, I got on the flight, not a problem. Paid for my own taxi. And then 2 days later, I was pulled into a room and given a written warning about my behaviour.
For oversleeping?
Yeah. There was no heads up. There was no one from HR. And my response was, okay, if I'm getting a written warning for being late to the coach, what are you doing about people doing coke on the beach? And funnily enough, they just 2 days later just threw it out and nothing happened. Yeah. But yeah, it was, my biggest thing was that no one from HR was there. And when they were we've got this meeting, I was like, do you want to give me a heads up on what it's about? So I was able to get out of it. But
also you still got your flight.
I know.
And if yeah.
I was like, I've done far worse things at a work party. So let's go back to Sam. What should Sam do next, especially in terms of it could feel a bit embarrassing to try and explain that?
Yeah, I would probably say I left and just try to get away with the fact that I don't have to explain being fired. Because the trouble is if they let Sam stay at that company that they were sacked from, it would be very difficult to defend that decision because culturally, you've signposted and said it's okay to badmouth the entire management team of the company, regardless of whether it was in jest.
Yeah, but I feel like roasting, if it's done.
It depends on what the context was.
Yeah.
If it was just a bit lighthearted, then yeah, it feels like a bit of a knee-jerk reaction. But if it was actually quite derogatory, then you have, to your point of one person in a team and their bad behaviour. If you're oh, it's fine, just slag off the CEO. Yeah,
true. You can't have one rule for one, not for others.
Yeah, exactly. I'd just try to sweep that under the rug and be I moved from there because it wasn't the right fit for me and I'm looking for a new opportunity and not go into too much detail about it.
Yeah, true. And just focus on making sure your CV demonstrates that what you have achieved there, not what you haven't, and how it kind of left.
Exactly.
I also think that's an easy one to kind of brush over, right?
Yeah, I mean, in theory, it should be.
But in terms of the legal rights that Sam would have in that situation,
very hard to tell from this. If they were at risk of discrimination for any kind of category, that kind of thing, or if there was anything else that happened at that Christmas party, there could be other stuff, but that sounds pretty black and white.
Or if there were other incidents where Sam had seen it and therefore felt comfortable enough that the company might find that funny. Like if
it's still very hard to defend from a legal perspective. Like even if there was a reason for them like saying it or doing it, it's still taking it too far. And like you'd still have to say, well, this thing led to this thing that then led me to get up on stage and roast the entire management team in a song. It's very, very hard to defend that behaviour, kind of regardless of whatever happens.
One of my first jobs, I worked at Sky, and every month on payday we went to Lucky Voice, there's karaoke booths, and we just it was so fun because the booze keeps flowing because they just keep bringing it to you.
Bringing it.
One of them, it was one of the guys leaving dues, and he chose a song for everyone. And his dad was a vicar, and for me, he chose "Son of a Preacher Man." And it was just so fun. I love a bit of karaoke.
We actually go a fair amount with Flexer as well. Like it is a good laugh. But
do you do like the open ones or the booths?
The booths.
Yeah.
I wouldn't get up on stage in front of loads of people that I don't know and sing karaoke. Absolutely no way.
I had another job where we used to go fairly regularly, maybe like once every few months, and the team always used to make me sing Adele because I can't sing for shit. So they were like, pick a really.
I only rap. Like
nice.
That's all I'll do because I can't sing at all.
What's your song of choice?
The Kanye bit of American Boy.
Oh my God, that's so good. The worst thing is going to karaoke with someone that can sing. Just ruin the vibe.
I know, I quite like it. Because if it's a big group and you've got 10 people that cannot sing at all and then a couple of people that can sing, it's nice to listen to it rather than a load of pigeons squawking. Sam, if you're listening, we hope that this helps and that you find a new opportunity soon, as much as I do think it was probably fair that they let you go.
Anyway, we love hearing those stories, so keep them coming in. I do want to touch a little bit because sometimes I'm seeing a lot of confusion between people getting fired and being made redundant.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of people being made redundant and then kind of almost like, I've been fired. Maybe we should touch on the difference. I feel like redundancy we'll cover in another episode, but maybe we should touch on the difference between the two.
Yeah, I mean, redundancy is ultimately that the role that you were doing no longer exists, and that's why you're not needed, whereas firing is more of a, we do not want you in this role. So I think that's the best way to kind of think about it. I think it's very tricky at the moment because obviously with the economic downturn, there's a massive number of redundancies happening. And that's just increasing at the moment as companies sort of bring down their headcount costs. So a lot of redundancy, but generally you can tell the difference because an entire department might be cut down because of redundancies. Like it's not just you going, like it's very unusual for, unless it's a tiny company, it's very unusual for just one role to be made redundant. And also there's lots of protection around that obviously we'll talk about in another episode, but you can't really make somebody redundant and then just rehire that role, whereas you can if somebody's sacked. Yeah,
we were talking about it off camera a little bit because there's this. I thought there was this like golden rule of like you can't rehire it for a year, but you were saying maybe it's less than that.
It can be depending on like business changes, restructuring, like all of that kind of thing. It's not that you can't rehire it for a whole year, but there's a lot of protection around that to ensure that companies aren't using redundancy as like thinly veiled firing.
I think that's happening a lot. Like I saw a role recently that was this most convoluted bullshit job title, and I called it out and I was like, this doesn't feel right. And the person that had been doing the job before was like, I was basically fired 1 week before the 2-year mark.
Yeah,
and they're rehiring the same role but just calling it something else.
Yeah, which does happen. And I think often, when companies go through mass redundancies, they will also use that as a time to get rid of their poor performers as sort of like a reset. Because it legally is a lot easier to do than firing. But just changing a job title, if the person that was made redundant from that role then saw that happen, like they could bring a case against the company for doing that, because it's just changing a job title isn't enough.
No.
You have to do much. It has to be a genuinely different role.
Fine. And then with firing, I guess we know that it's all about understanding your rights, get legal advice if you need to. But redundancy, I guess it's more understanding the package you're being offered and what that looks like.
There should be like really specific procedures around redundancy. It shouldn't just be sprung on you. There are compensation packages around it, whether the company kind of does their own voluntary one, or if you've been in service for more than 2 years, then there's like a specific proportion of your salary that you'll get. If you're made redundant for each year of service that you've done. So it shouldn't just be, oh, you've been made redundant, goodbye, that's that. Like there should have been a proper process around it.
When it comes to companies restructuring, there's often like a 30-day consultation period. Are there any other things that someone should know when they're, as an employee, when their company is restructuring?
Yeah, well, there's the big one of like, is there anywhere else that they could be put? So if there are other roles open and they have the skills to be able to do that role, then they need to be heard in an interview for that role to see if they could be given it. Yes. It's a really important one for companies to remember, because most companies at the moment are just making roles redundant rather than also hiring at the same time. But if they are hiring at the same time, they have to consider all of those people for those roles as well.
Yeah, sure.
And obviously, I assume you've interviewed a lot of people. Have you ever got the sense, or have you ever seen somebody explain being fired or let go in a good way? Or have you ever got the sense that somebody was?
No, but I feel like if someone's, I don't know, I think actually the smartest is that it's probably is hidden, right?
You try to own it, yeah.
Yeah. So if someone does own it, then, what have they learned from it? So I'm sure we both agree that the biggest lessons you ever get in life is from failures. So what have they learned from it? Or also it may just be that the role wasn't right. So why wasn't the role right? What are they looking for now? And I think that one of the best hires I ever made, she hadn't been fired, but she was leaving. She was interviewing with me 4 months into joining a new job. And I asked her about that, and she was like, it just isn't right where I am. And I think you know that. So I think if someone is trying to explain themselves in an interview, own it a little bit if you can. Be clear, be concise. Don't badmouth the company. I think rather than focus on badmouthing the company, focus on what you've learned and what you're looking for next.
Absolutely agree with that. I think it's a big red flag when somebody comes into an interview and is badmouthing loads of aspects of what they were doing before. I think it's better, to your point of like, I learned this from this. I worked out that actually this is what I want from my next employer. Trying to spin it positively, because it's hard not to look badly on somebody that is just complaining.
Yes, it's better to focus on what you got from it rather than what you didn't, or the employer. And you can pick up signs that it probably wasn't a great company, but they don't need to explain it in that way. And I guess touching on your point earlier about references, it's better to just be quite honest with what's happened. So rather than fudge some response, like, I think you can, by owning it a little bit more, you protect yourself from, if it does go to getting a recommendation and they found out you bullshitted, then you're not really going to get much further, are you?
You're not going to get much further than that. It's a hard balance to tread between being honest, but also making sure that you're in control of the narrative. So it's finding whatever balance you're most comfortable with of those two things, but don't outright lie. Yeah, because you will get caught in your lies.
I feel like that's it for this episode. Thank you so much for joining us. And remember, getting fired isn't the end of the world. It's an opportunity to learn, grow, and move forward.
Ultimately, it is an opportunity. So how can our listeners reach out and share their own stories or ask us questions in the future?
You can reach out to us on Instagram. We're at workingonit.pod. Or email us hello@workingonit.show. What are we discussing next time, Molly?
Next time, we are talking about managing conflict, which will be a bit of a juicy topic.
Can't wait.
Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time. Until then, keep working on it.